Jetzt habe ich die Ehre, Karl Fagerström anzumoderieren. Karl ist wahrscheinlich allen bekannt. Seit etwa 50 Jahren arbeitet er an diesem Thema Rauchentwöhnung, studiert klinische Psychologie in Uppsala, hat selbst eine Rauchfreiklinik eröffnet gehabt, ist der Erfinder natürlich des Fagerström-Tests und hat jahrelang an der mit der Nikorette gearbeitet, an Strategien zur Rauchentwöhnung, ist Mitbegründer der SRNT, die schon genannt worden ist in einem der Slides von Nicola, Society for the Research of Nicotine and Tobacco, hat das Ganze...
Ist genug.
Ist es genug?
Ja.
Okay, gut, also viele Dinge, für die er gleich auch noch gefragt werden kann, und bitte Karl, the floor is yours.
Danke sehr. Danke sehr für die nette Einladung zu dieser wichtigen Vorstellung. Leider bin meine Kenntnis in der deutschen Sprache nicht gut genug, um ein wissenschaftliches Vortrag machen. Darum bitte ich Sie um Entschuldigung und anfangen mit Englisch. Die Fragen vielleicht könne ich, wenn Sie langsam und deutlich sprechen, verstehen und antworten. So this is my disclosure. I think I have consulted for most of the pharma companies with an interest in smoking cessation, and more recently also with some tobacco companies in developing less harmful products. Before going into this, I was sitting and hearing about cytisine. And do you know that in 1975, cytisine was used in Berlin at the smoking cessation clinic. It was called Tabex, tobacco exit, and I got some samples with me back to Sweden, and certainly it was very active, but it wasn't accessible on the market. It came from Bulgaria by a company there. Okay, so now let's go into the prevalence of smoking in the European Union. We see we have, this doesn't look very well, but Sweden is in the leftmost part, the yellow bar, with only 5% smokers there. And where do we see Germany? Quite a lot of more smokers. This low smoking prevalence, you would think that that would turn into also some less tobacco attributable death. And so it does. Particularly in the Swedish men, we have the lowest tobacco attributable death. And if it was completely random where you would be on this list, there is 1 out of 27, there are 27 observations, that Sweden would be in the bottom with tobacco-related disease. However, there are 2 more countries that are similar to Sweden, and that is Norway. Here they have the second lowest, and there is Iceland. And in all these 3 countries are less harmful tobacco and nicotine products in heavy use, and in no other country here. So the likelihood, from a statistical point of view, that all 3 would end up in the first, second, and third place is something like 1 out of 25,000. So it's a statistical significance that you hardly have heard of before. Also, there has been calculations that if the German men had had the same tobacco habits as Swedish men, there would have been 40,000 fewer deaths per year among German men. 40,000. Is there anything else in preventative health that could give such a harvest? I think not. So what has contributed to this low rate of smoking in Sweden? Yeah, we have had a lot of activities, of course, tobacco tax We have limited or bans in restaurants and advertising, etc., etc. And many NGOs, and particularly here the Swedish Cancer Society, they claim that all these assessments have increased tobacco control and pushed down smoking. However, if we look at the European tobacco control scale, how does Sweden rank according to other countries? Sweden comes in the 21st place. So there is 20 countries that has a better tobacco control than Sweden. And Germany is even lower, on the 34th place. So there is certainly still room for activities in Germany to increase the anti-tobacco control. You would think if these tobacco control measures were important, you would have very low smoking rate in Ireland, the UK, France, the Netherlands, that have the strongest anti-tobacco climate. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Personally, I think this has something to do with why Sweden has reached the end game and have the lowest smoking prevalence. And that is, we see the increase in Snus use from the early 70s and the communicating jar effect that the tobacco used for cigarettes is coming down. And just to show you a little bit of what happened in the neighboring country, Norway, they also have little tobacco attributable harm now because the daily tobacco use has come down steadily. And again, there is this communicating jar with snus use going up. So probably contributing to Norway's low tobacco attributed death. Tobacco is actually ideal for a harm reduction approach. For alcohol, it wouldn't work because alcohol is the not so safe substance, dangerous substance, and alcohol is also what those who are drinking alcohol needs and wants. But with tobacco, most people want the nicotine. That's what they like, and that's what the major part of the dependence come from. But pure nicotine, and even unburned tobacco, the Swedish snus, is not the primary cause of tobacco-related morbidity and mortality. Most of the harmful effects, they come from the combustion. And if you have a fireplace in your wohnung, you don't want to go close to that and inhale smoke from any source. And of course, that's organic matter. It's also organic matter in a tobacco cigarette. So it's quite evident that smoke must be difficult. So I could, of course, now look into some individual studies on how harmful, for example, non-combustible tobacco products like Swedish snus are. But rather than doing that would be boring, I go to some high-level statements here. The first by former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb that said 2018 that from FDA, I should mention FDA, nicotine, while highly addictive, is delivered through products on a continuum of risk, and that in order to successfully address cigarette addiction, we must make it possible for current adult smokers who still seek nicotine to get it from alternative and less harmful sources. A little later in 24 last year, he was joined by another former commissioner at FDA, Mark McMillan, and they said in the JAMA, for these currently nicotine-addicted adult smokers, the opportunity to convert to non-combustible products offering nicotine delivery without the combustion-related health risks should be a renewed part of the public health agenda. And here, fairly recently, the Swedish new nicotine white pouches, the brand name of Sin, was approved by FDA, and at the same time they issued a communication. This toxic mix of chemicals, not nicotine, caused the serious health effects among those who use tobacco products. Not nicotine, but the other chemicals from combustion, including fatal lung disease, chronic obstructive, etc., etc. So the case is very clear, and FDA doesn't take such reviews lightly, I can assure you. A little bit more into detail with Sweden. So we are looking at attributable tobacco death per 100,000, according to WHO. And we then look at men here, lung cancer, other cancer, cardiovascular, all causes. We have the median value of the EU countries, maximum value, and the minimum value excluding Sweden. When it comes to lung cancer, Swedish men are lower than the next lowest country, the same for other cancer, the same for cardiovascular disease, quite a bit of difference. And all causes, there are 550 dying in European Union per 100,000, while in Sweden it's 222. Great, great difference, and that's also why 40,000 men in Germany would have been saved had they had the same tobacco habits as the Swedish men. So now, what do we see with women? If we look at the women population, all causes is 52 out of 100,000. The median value in the European Union is 44. So the Swedish women are not doing any good at all. They are worse than the rest of the European Union. That is simply, I think, because the Swedish women, they were early emancipated and started to smoke, and already in the 70s, 80s, there were as many women as men smoking. Whilst men turned over, switched to snus, women did not, up until relatively recently. And the figures you see here, they are from the last 50 years. So the habits of the Swedish females are not reflected here. So this is, in a sense, if you like, a quasi-experiment. When you talk about the men, you might say, yeah, Scandinavia, it's a special culture. They eat a lot of seal, herring, and they have good welfare, and it might be the food or whatever. But if that is the case, you would think the same would happen with the women, but it hasn't. So I think we can skip this. Swedish snus was the first less harmful product to be accepted by the Federal Food and Drug Administration. Here we have a picture showing the potential harmfulness of different products. And when we get to combustible cigarettes here, we have a figure of 655. All combustible products are rated high here. This is what the exposure from these products. When we get down to non-combustible products, we see that we are on a very different scale. And in the very end here, we have snus, nicotine replacement, and non-tobacco pouches. This is not epidemiology, though, so this is from exposure from the products, what you could expect. This is also an interesting slide. The smoking is down to 4.9% daily smoking in Sweden. Relatively similar now, men and women. Any tobacco use is 16, and any nicotine use is at 22.5%, which is not that different to Germany. I think you are a couple of percentages higher. So as many Swedes use nicotine as the Germans. With us, much better health outcome is dependent on the difference in the products that we are using. So Sweden is a superpower when it comes to one area. I don't know if there's anything to be proud of, but snus, of course, is a Swedish product. Nicotine replacement was invented in Sweden during the late 60s and developed in the early 70s. And also the white non-tobacco nicotine pouch also came out of Sweden, where the first product was approved as an NRT in 2009. And this nicotine pouches was supposed to be an even less harmful product than the snus, because the snus, although produced under Gothia Tech and having very few toxicants, there were some nitrosamines and heavy metals, and here the idea was to get rid of these products. So there are several brands here. The major ones are Velocin and On. And these products are very similar to the nicotine replacement products. And that we can see on this slide. They all use pharma-grade nicotine. I think they might even buy it from the same company. So there is no different the nicotine in a white pouch to a nicotine gum or a nicotine patch. The nicotine needs to be bound to something. Here it's microcrystalline cellulose. And here there is also for a gum, you need another carrier. You have sweeteners, which are also very much the same across the NRT and pouch products. The pH need to be increased a bit to have an absorption across the oral mucosa. Therefore, sodium carbonate in different forms are included. The two areas where these consumer nicotine pouches and NRT nicotine pouches differ is with flavorings and the nicotine content. There are many more flavors and there is much more higher nicotine content. And these two things, the flavors and the nicotine content, need to be regulated. The sooner the better, because there are products out there that might risk the whole category while it has so much potential utility and to bring to the area here. So if the nicotine content is reasonable and the flavorings, the type of flavorings are reasonable, the health and adverse effects would be similar, very similar to the nicotine gum, the nicotine patch, the nicotine lozenge. This is a slide to show a little bit how many harmful and potentially harmful constituents you find in a cigarette with the definitions used in this study, 84, much less on snus, although probably a little bit more than from nicotine gum and nicotine pouch and nicotine lozenge. But these three are so close, so you wouldn't say that there is any difference here. The same on another study. Here, the average of 4 different nicotine pouches have been assessed, and we have an average of nicotine gum and nicotine lozenge 4 milligram. And when it comes to these harmful and potentially harmful constituents, there is no difference between these two. So they are very similar. So tobacco-free nicotine pouches are likely to have the best potential for harm reduction among smokers who switch, and a little bit more controversial among naive subjects who otherwise would have started with other nicotine and tobacco-containing products. Now, this is the first time I am proud to have a Swedish government that has been able to see what's right and wrong in this area. I have heard for so many decades that all tobacco products are equally harmful. We cannot treat them differentially. This current government has clearly spoken out that they are behind a harm reduction perspective. And it was not just lip service. Look at this. They lowered the tax on snus by 20%. Have you ever heard of anyone lowering a tax on tobacco or alcohol? And increased it on cigarettes. So that means today that the price in euro for a cigarette, one dose of nicotine, is roughly 31 cents. A snus bag, a lot cheaper, 22%. And a non-tobacco pouch, just 18 cents. Very, very cheap. And there is a very, very low tax on the non-tobacco pouch. So this is, in my mind, how a regulation should happen. And this smoking prevalence of 4.9% were assessed almost a year ago. Since we have had these assessments introduced, and I think with the price incentives, the prevalence of smoking will accelerate downwards. So for me, it's relatively easy to suggest a regulatory system. We have one for alcohol, and we need one for nicotine. And just as with alcohol, we are limiting their access according to their harm. We should do the same with nicotine-containing products. We make a continuum, and we discuss where each product sits on that continuum, and then we give tax accordingly, availability, maybe minimum age, marketing practices, etc. And we would see much more rapid gain in gaining health among the smokers, switching to less harmful products. So the last slide. What I have been preaching here today, it's not so easy for a lot of people to understand and to agree with. And I've been wondering, and I'm sure this has happened to more than me, how come that it is so difficult? With alcohol, it's relatively simple. I think that the smoking prevalence can be reduced with alternative products. It's difficult. Sorry, I'm wrong. I have one more slide. So what I've been shown here is that smoking prevalence can be reduced with alternative products, snus and nicotine pouches. For Sweden, we have convincing data. I could have shown a lot more, also from Norway and Iceland. It can happen without resource-demanding governmental policies. Now, why aren't we using this already? What are the obstacles? So I think that one obstacle is that people in general believe that nicotine is more harmful than it is. We are talking about nicotine. Nicotine is a drug. Drugs are bad. Drugs are very bad. So I think there need to be, if this should be, I mean, if a government would embark on a regulation that I mentioned for alcohol, for nicotine, the government at the same time, for that to be effective, need to inform the population that it isn't the nicotine, but what you are getting rid of when you are switching that is harmful. And that's why you would be much better off. So public education is needed. We have the end game, as it was spelled out by World Health Organization, for smoking. And then it makes sense that you introduce less harmful products as long as they diminish smoking. But I do see tendencies now to change the end game to nicotine, and introducing new, even harmless nicotine products, if they are, wouldn't help because it's still nicotine use. So here we must make a decision whether nicotine can be dependence forming, which is a little bit further down here. And as long as we have nicotine in the population, there will be some who are dependent. As long as we have alcohol, there will be some who are dependent. As long as we have caffeine, some will be dependent. More will be dependent now with energy drinks and sugar. Sugar and coffee, high doses, used by 7, 8 year, 9, 10 children. So we probably, at least that's my position here, that nicotine needs to be regulated. It should not be readily available. It should not be cheap. It shouldn't be advertised. But maybe we need to accept that there is some nicotine use in the society as much as we have accept other cultural drugs. If we don't do that, if we ban, does that mean that it doesn't exist in that country any longer? Of course it will exist from a black market, thriving organized crime, with products that are unregulated and probably more harmful than if the government would have done the proper regulation. I have mentioned that dependence to nicotine is something that exists. Dependence to caffeine also exists. I did a study in the Swedish population, a representative study, and found that the average nicotine user was a bit more dependent than the average caffeine user. But when we asked the question, do you consider yourself highly dependent? We found that there were more such people among the caffeine users simply because 90% of the population use caffeine. So the average user can be lower than nicotine, but in absolute terms there are so many. We don't consider coffee the dependence a big problem simply because it's not that harmful. And maybe nicotine is close to that at least. And finally, another thing that makes this difficult for many people, that is that the big tobacco industry is profiting from reduced harm products. And that, I think, was the final slide. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Karl Fagerström, für diesen tollen Überblick aus einem Land, das es geschafft hat, in diesen Bereich zu kommen, des Endgames, wie das so schön heißt, und hat uns gezeigt, wo wir tatsächlich noch viel zu lernen haben und viel zu verändern haben. Wenn wir allein in Deutschland sehen, die Regulation, die Steuerveränderungen, die wir erlebt haben, die undifferenziert sind und gerade nicht motivierend sind, für Menschen aufzuhören. Okay. Many thanks again, Karl.